This is Dateline News and Conversation. Got an interesting guest tonight and an interesting topic. The topic: the crisis of hegemony, the United States at war, Ukraine, Gaza, and Taiwan. My guest tonight, Professor George Wright. He's Professor Emeritus at from the Department of Political Science at Cal State University, Chico, California. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Regis. My honor.
Okay, this is a big subject. We can't talk about it enough. What's the historical context before we get deep into this?
Yeah, well, my major concern, Regis, in following politics and contemporary events, obviously, is the big picture. And what you notice is that the corporate media in the United States and in most of the Western world it distorts and promotes what I call kind of truth by omission, if you will, without again providing the context to events. For example, this Russians went into Ukraine in 2024, and it was unprovoked. And obviously, October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel, it was perceived to be unprovoked. But the bottom line, as you and your audiences know, there's a great nuanced historical context that these developments occur in. And without understanding that background, one cannot understand the motivation of, say, the Russians and Ukraine or Hamas and the Palestinians vis-a-vis Israel. So I think it's very, very important to understand the big picture. Unfortunately, even many what I would consider progressives or liberal left or left-wing commentators that we find on the YouTube who provide invaluable amount of information about the ongoing developments in the war over Ukraine, as well as the war in Gaza, and for that matter, events around the South China Sea and elsewhere. Oftentimes, they don't present the context as well. And so I go out of my way to try to provide that so-called big picture. I think a few theoretical and conceptual points need to be made. My view is shaped very strongly by people like Emanuel Wallerstein and Stephen Gill and a number of other people that have dealt with the idea of the world system or the world capitalist system, or as I like to call the hierarchical, integrated, interstate world system, which is a system that one could debate. Wallerstein and Andre Gunther Frank debated exactly what were the moments of origins of this system. But I think 1492 is a good moment to understand the beginnings of that system where the Europeans made their initial contact with the so-called New World, if you will. And what we see is the development of this world system that is highly integrated, but at the same time, it operates in a particular way where there is a core and a periphery. And some argue that there is also a semi-periphery as well, and that the core exploits the periphery and the semi-periphery. And in fact, that is the main reason why the core is as wealthy as it is. And obviously, we're talking about Western Europe historically, and then the United States. And there have been regional hegemons as well, Japan at a particular moment in time as well. It seems to me when you have that kind of framework, you can see certain contours that have existed for hundreds of years. But at the same time, those contours are very, very constant and also very relevant today. For example, what we see is the hegemon is the hegemon for basically four reasons. One, it has the most advanced economic system in the world. Second, it has the most powerful military in the world. Third, it has the dominant currency, if you will, the dollar or the pound during the 19th century. And also, it has the so-called moral high ground, the ideological rationale for its being. Currently, the United States uses the notion of the exceptional nation or the indispensable nation. For the American experience, manifest destiny in the 19th century was very prominent. For the British, what we saw was free trade was a dominant theme at that period. Being a hegemon gives that nation a certain advantage, and that advantage is that it can exploit the periphery. As it exploits the periphery, it must develop a military that protects that periphery. And over a period of time, you see resources, capital being transferred back to the core. But what happens is at a certain historical moment, we can see the rise of what the great Dutch theorist Kees van der Peel called competitor states that emerge with a new technologies, new economic platforms that can be competitive to the core. Now, what happens is there's a contradiction also within the system, and that is the core, because it becomes the hegemon and it has this outreach, fails to reinvest into its domestic plant, which gave it the hegemony in the first place. And so what you see is a relative decline of that hegemon as we see the emergence of the competitor states. And what we can see is that there is a fault line between those two dynamics that historically sees competition on a range of different levels, certainly economic competition. We see the emergence of rivalry, which can become very intense rivalry. And thirdly, you see the rise of war or warfare, wars that are on regional wars, proxy wars, wars that are on the periphery. And at a particular moment, we can see warfare evolving into a global war. Now, when you look at history with that framework, we can say that when the British defeated the French finally in 1815, we see the British as Pax Britannica in the 19th century. But by the last quarter of the 19th century, we see the rise of competitor states, Germany and Europe, which is going to be significant in this, also the United States and Japan. And so for the next 60 to 70 years, what we see is intense competition, rivalry, and certainly warfare, regional or peripheral wars. And then we see two global world wars, although my argument is that World War I and World War II are basically the same war. By 1945, we see the United States emerge as now the global hegemon, and the rivals up until that point are either occupied and or weakened quite dramatically. We can just look at the history of Britain after 45, the role, the structural linkage that Germany has, and certainly Japan. So in 1945, again, the United States emerges this global hegemon. But what's very important is it was a global hegemon over a bipolar world order, meaning there was a alternative system under the aegis of the Soviet Union, which pursued obviously its own regional hegemonic objectives to create a condos sanitaire in Eastern Europe for specific reasons. And we'll get into that in a moment. So we see that development. And then the next major point I want to say to lead our story up to the present is that the United States, at the end of the war, and I would argue, if you read Larry Shoup and Bill Munter's book, The Imperial Brain Trust, they talk about how the Council on Foreign Relations and other Eastern establishment forces, as early as 1942, began to establish structures and ideas for the post-World War II order, understanding that the United States was going to come out of that as the dominant power. So after the war, you see the United States establishing a number of different structures and policies to facilitate that hegemony, at the same time recognizing the existence of the Soviet Union. A couple of things that were put into place. One was a national security state, and you can look at the 1947 National Security Act to see the formation of that national security state, the formation of the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for example. Now, the second thing, certain specific guidelines were formed as well. And those guidelines were based on two forms of ideas that are kind of the backside of the same coin. One was an open door, which actually goes back to John Hayes, the Secretary of State of the United States back in 1898, when he formulated the so-called open door notes, demanding that the imperial powers provide the United States an open door to China at that period. So we see a contemporaneous definition of the open door, and also anti-communism is the other side of the coin. And we'll comment on that in a contemporary sense in a moment. Now, in light of these guidelines, what we see is the development of, and this is very, very important, is the development of strategic doctrine, meaning formal documents that are the product of study, research, formulation, and implementation. And so the two major strategic doctrines at that point were, one, the Truman Doctrine of 1947, which basically defines containment, meaning the idea of the containment of communism. In 1950, we see a top secret document that later became available, and that was National Security 68, or NSC 68. And these are documents that are available online, by the way, if anyone's interested in studying this material. NSC 68 basically defines rollback, meaning that the United States was committed to containment of communism, but it was also committed to the rollback of so-called communism as well, which helps us to understand the various peripheral wars, the wars that were on the periphery during and events during that period, whether it was covert CIA operations or certainly the Vietnam War as an example. Now, the fourth element in this structure is military Keynesianism, meaning to use military spending as a means of guaranteeing basic profits for certain sectors of the economy. We could go into a long discussion about the debates about that was being held by elites during that time, related to whether to dismantle the military and how that would have an effect on the U.S. economy. Keep in mind that prior to World War II, the United States, just like most of the world, was wrapped up in a depression. So there was a fear that there might be a depression, or at least a deep recession after the war. So my basic point here, and then I'll move on to something else to try to bring it up to the present, is that, again, in 1945, the United States became the global hegemon over a bipolar world order. and then it established a set of structures, domestic and global, NATO and the Bretton Woods structures as well, plus guidelines and strategic documents to pursue that that objective, or it's to sustain and further its hegemony. Also, what's central is an economy that is going to be centering around Cold War militarism, if you will. So now the next point I want to make is to kind of head towards the future. In 1991, what we see is the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And what's important here is that communism, quote unquote, disappears. And so if you have a national security state that was structured to eliminate communism, now communism basically is disappearing. And certainly your main protagonist, the Soviet Union, is disintegrating. So are you going to have peace dividends and a more cooperative world, or are you going to take advantage of this new world order, if you will, and pursue, and this is my argument, the US began to pursue absolute global hegemony, meaning to try to gain access and control of areas that it had not had direct control over prior to 1991. And this would be part of what Spikeman calls the rimland, Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what happened with this pursuit of absolute global hegemony, you didn't have a threat at that moment, or an entity that could challenge US hegemony. So what you see, and this is very, very important, I believe, to the current situation, what you see is the formulation in the early 1990s of a set of documents, strategic documents, to kind of establish the ground rules or the outline of what US post-World War II, post-Cold War policies was going to be. Some of you are probably familiar with some of these documents, but I'm going to mention two that I think are seminal in this discussion. One was the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine, which was written by Paul Wolfowitz, who was the director of the State Department's Department of Policy Planning, which ironically was the same position that George Kennan had in the late 1940s when he formulated the first version of containment. The Wolfowitz Doctrine can be understood in the following sentence that's taken from or a small paragraph that's taken from the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And that is, our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formally by the Soviet Union. The next sentence is also very important. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power. So to put this into my words, the US in the early 1990s formulated a policy that, using the existing national security apparatus, was not going to allow a peer competitor or a competitor state to emerge anywhere in the world. Now, I think what's important here as well historically is in the 90s, Russia was relatively weak. And in fact, the United States and its technocrats have great influence in shaping the political economy of Russia. So the United States didn't look at Russia as a challenge to its hegemony, or in this instance, its pursuit of global hegemony. Instead, the U.S. tried to make Russia into kind of a compliant or comprador state. Let's see, what else do we want to say here? And at the same time, the U.S. began to pursue more geoeconomic strategies, financial globalization-oriented strategies. Now, what you can define this period as, if 1945 to 1991 was a period of global hegemony over a bipolar world order, the United States now sat as the sole superpower over a unipolar world order as it began to pursue absolute global hegemony. But what's important is by the early 2000s, and each individual history, that is the history of Russia at that time, and the history of China, and for that matter, Iran, etc., can be viewed separately, but in a totality. By the early 2000s, related to Russia and China in particular, you see the beginnings of the rise of competitor states, meaning them as competitors to the United States' pursuit of absolute global hegemony. Now, I'm not 100% sure exactly what is the date when this changed, whether it was 2001, whether it was 2008, whether it was 2013 or whatever. But certainly in the last 10 years or so, we've obviously seen the US look at China and Russia and as peer competitors, as challenges to its global hegemony. Now, related to strategic doctrine, by 2018, the United States shifted its strategic doctrine from being involved in counterterrorism to a document that I think is important, and that's National Defense Strategy 2008, with its subtitle, Sharpening the American Military's Competitive Edge. So you could go online and find National Defense Strategy 2018, Sharpening the American Military's Competitive Edge, and see the reformulation of the Wolfowitz Doctrine in a more contemporary sense. And what that strategy said is now China was a strategic competitor or a peer competitor, exactly what the Wolfowitz Doctrine did not want to emerge or reemerge, etc. Russia was also defined as a strategic competitor, but China was defined as more challenging to American hegemony than Russia. So what we see in an outline form, there is structure, strategic thinking and doctrines, and a certain economic agenda related to American foreign policy that has evolved and shifted depending on the terrain involved. Regis, I'm going to stop right now, and maybe let me say one more thing. Is what I want to argue is that the war over Ukraine, the tensions in the South China Sea, as well as the events, the conflict in and around Gaza and Palestine, can be situated. First of all, they have their own specific histories, but they can be specifically situated along that fault line that I talked about earlier, where between the hegemon in decline and the rise of the competitor states. And in that sense, all three of those crises are interconnected rather than something separate. So let me finish up with more or less a contemporary framework.
George, can
Okay,
I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. This historical context is drop dead critical to understand what's going on today. And you did a wonderful job of presenting that. But I'd like to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Wasn't it Bill Clinton, beginning with NAFTA, who began offshoring America's industry, not only to Mexico, but to China?
Sure.
Everything we would buy almost everywhere at Target or any of our department stores came from China. Now, Clinton also had a great deal to do, in my opinion, with what happened in Russia in the late 1990s. And I would want to ask you, would you agree that the year 2000, when Vladimir Putin became president of Russia, Russia began rising from the ashes and gradually moving to a very powerful competitor or threat to Russia? And in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, Putin got up and gave perhaps the speech that made him U.S. public enemy number one. Would you think that those two events had a great deal to do with the development of the United States strategic and military doctrine?
Oh, of course I would. Yes, they're integral, very deeply integral to the whole story. I would like to add, however, that the outsourcing of U.S. manufacturing base started in the early 1970s, and I think there are these kind of moments of genesis, if you will, that more or less help us to understand how we got here. And I think one of them is in the late 60s, the United States' economy or the corporate interests began to face what Marx calls a falling rate of profit. And to deal with that, rather than to restructure the U.S. economy in a national sense, it abrogated a 100-year national development project and began to pursue the early stages of a more globalized U.S. dominated economy by outsourcing manufacturing, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, etc. It was later that China becomes the platform for that, but I agree 1,000,000% that certainly by 2000 that was the case.
So
related to Clinton,
let me ask you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one more question.
Sure.
Because my own position is that beginning with Harry Truman, when he ordered the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a message to Joseph Stalin that we have this weapon and we are really number one. And as I trace history from that moment, you can see the anti-communist, anti-Soviet belief continue to grow in the United States right through Eisenhower, Kennedy. And when it got to Ronald Reagan, I wonder if you agree with me, Reagan perhaps had more to do with this anti-Russian, anti-Soviet belief in the United States when he called the evil empire a nation without a soul. And from that point on, we can see that not only the United States policy towards Russia, but the Russophobic ideology that evolved in the American people. So much so to the extent that today, if you mention Putin or Russia, they see the devil.
It's true. It's very true. Yes.
Yeah. And so I trace it, and I know we're going to go there probably very soon. The war in Ukraine is a direct evolution of the American fear of Russia now being a competitive superpower.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the policy of the United States, stated very clearly by Joseph Biden, is the strategic defeat of Russia, to break it up, balkanize it, and steal its resources.
Yeah. I have no difficulty with your views, Regis. I agree with them very, very strongly. At the same time, what we want to, I don't want to put all the onus on Reagan in creating this anti-Soviet, this Russia-phobia. I think the person that I look at who had more influence in all of this was Brezhnev-Brzezinski. And he was Carter's national security advisor in the late 1970s. And he was a strong Russia-phobic person. And much of this was derived from his own personal history as a Pole. And what I think is the genesis is before Reagan. Reagan, in fact, inherits what I'm about to describe. But in the 1970s, there was an ongoing debate and struggle within the United States foreign policy establishment over how to deal with the decline of hegemony that the U.S. faced after the Tet Offensive, as well as the rise of Western Europe and Japanese capitalism, and the proliferation of third world revolutions in the world, Angola, Mozambique, obviously the defeat in Vietnam. So we see Nixon and Kissinger with a strategy of détente with linkage. And then Carter comes in with this goal of a trilateral framework, détente without linkage, and to not use anti-communism, but to use human rights as the framework for its foreign policy. But immediately upon the Carter administration coming into power, the Cold Warriors, if you will, the neoconservatives, Scoop Jackson, Sam Nunn in Congress, Paul Nitze, who was the architect of NSC 68, by the way, in 1950, they organized this group called the Committee on the Present Danger, which put enormous pressure on Carter to move away from his détente, cut military budget, de-emphasize anti-communism, to minimize direct military intervention, and push Carter to move towards a hardline position with the Soviet Union. At the same time, Brzezinski, working within the administration as national security advisor, was challenging we called more regionalist or managerial forces in the Carter administration, like Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who by middle of 1978, and certainly by early 1979, had lost favor within the Carter administration, and Brzezinski began to have dominance over U.S. foreign policy. Part of that strategy was normalizing relations with China. Keep in mind that China was basically at war with Russia at that point in time, increased military spending, and also to begin providing covert military support to the anti-Kabul rebels that were housed in Peshawar in Pakistan, who later became Reagan's freedom fighters or the Mujahideen, to put military pressure on Kabul with the intent to literally, and this is Brzezinski's words, to suck the Soviet Union into Afghanistan to create its own Vietnam. Okay, and so the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan in December of 1979, and the Carter administration reacted to this out of shock. But in fact, all of this had been planned months and several years ahead of this to be prepared for this moment. And we see as Fred Halliday called it, the second Cold War. And it is Reagan that's elected within that context who pursues this agenda that you talked about, Regis, until there was a reassessment in the Soviet Union and we see Gorbachev come into power. Now, leaping to Clinton pursues a two-track policy. One is economic policy, globalization, et cetera, neoliberal globalization and so-called democratization. But he also pursued NATO enlargement. And that is directly related to strategic ideas that were being articulated in the Department of Defense and elsewhere within the bureaucracy to incorporate Eastern Europe into a U.S. alliance that would, as it was defined in the literature, be a collective security. But in fact, it was an aggressive, offensive strategy towards Russia. Although Putin wasn't in power yet. And then what we see also is the redefinition of the role of NATO with the Yugoslav wars in the late 90s, where NATO shifted from being an alleged defensive apparatus or alliance. I always believed that it really was not there to, it was there to keep Germany out of an alliance with the Soviet Union. It wasn't necessarily a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. But NATO was now an offensive alliance, and this conflict was an out-of-area war, which then makes NATO a global military power for the United States, which is more relevant today than it was even in 1998 or 1999. And then Putin comes into power, and he quickly, as a Russian nationalist, committed to Russian national security and national sovereignty over a restructured capitalist economy, who's willing to cooperate and trade with the West, but under terms that were committed to national security and national sovereignty. This was something that the United States did not like. I referred earlier to the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and the second sentence, which said that any country in the region that would control resources under consolidated control. That's a very important concept here, because during the Cold War, we always thought it was anti-communism. So when communism, quote unquote, disappears, then the United States shouldn't be upset. But what we really realized that communism was a euphemism for national sovereignty and national independence and national control of one's own resources, therefore consolidated control. So Putin comes into power committed to, using Wolfowitz's language, consolidated control, but cooperation with the West. In fact, there's a moment when Putin asked to become a member of NATO, which was dropped like a hot potato, because that wasn't the goal of the US. The goal was to colonize Russia. And as you say, Regis, to dismantle Russia, which is still on the agenda to this very day. Now, the NATO enlargement is part of, again, this military encirclement of Russia, and Putin, as you say quite accurately, at the Munich summit in 2007, sitting in front, by the way, on the first row was John McCain and Lieberman and
yeah.
these neoconservative power brokers in the United States, and they were sitting there. Actually, if you look at the video, they almost were laughing at Putin, meaning that they looked at Putin as saying, "We want sovereignty. These are our red lines." And they didn't care. They didn't care what Putin said because they were going to push and push and push. And what that leads to eventually, as you all know, is the U.S. orchestrated coup in 2013, 2014 in Ukraine, the so-called Maidan Revolution, if you will. And then all of the events that have occurred in and around Ukraine from 2014 up until February 24th, 2022. But throughout all of this, the Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin, was pretty consistent. One of the things that there's so many contradictions and so many weird aspects to all of this, but the U.S. media in the West and political leaders in the U.S. have always said, we don't know what Putin is thinking. We don't know what Putin is thinking. Read his speeches. Listen to his speeches. He's crystal clear what he means.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah. So, but anyway, that I hope that provides a little more detail to the context.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I agree completely, wholeheartedly with how you've traced this whole thing. And I'm not sure exactly where you want to go with it now, but we're talking about the war in Ukraine. NATO has been exposed to be a toothless tiger. Mm-hmm. The United States, I believe, has also been exposed, not only with Ukraine, but I know you're going to talk about this, what's happened in Israel, and the U.S. support, and this insane aggression towards China over Taiwan. The hegemon's in real trouble. And I think you're going to agree with me, because you've been talking about the declining hegemon. I think it's become apparent to the whole world.
Yeah, so there's no debate. This fault line that I talked about between the hegemon and the competitor states, as the hegemon is in decline, you have competition, rivalry, and warfare. Well, that's exactly where we're at this particular moment. To jump ahead real quick, these wars are truly existential wars because the United States, quote unquote, cannot lose, quote unquote. And obviously Russia is not and cannot lose either. The U.S. could lose, but the U.S., as it's constituted since 1945, and I would say that the DNA goes all the way back to the Puritans back in the 17th century. As the U.S. has been constituted since 1945, it cannot psychologically, emotionally, and ideologically accept being a co-equal in a multipolar world order. That is, to me, the crisis of the moment. Now, to back off a little bit, to put kind of another level of the framework, is that you see Germany, for example, and Europe buying energy sources from Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So if the notion of the Wolfowitz doctrine is to not allow a reemergence of a power in Eurasia that could have control over resources and be a rival to the United States, there are basically three entities with a sub-entity that can constitute the potential challenge. One is an independent Europe dominated by Germany, aligned with China and Russia. an independent Russia that is aligned with Germany and Western Europe, and or aligned with China, or all three, or with both China and Europe, and thirdly, a independent China that pursues Eurasian integration. And there are many levels to this, but obviously the Belt Road Initiative is a major thrust of this process. And so the United States can't allow that to happen. So what the U.S. has to do is to break the linkages between Europe and Russia, politically, ideologically, and economically, and structurally. And I would argue blowing up Nord Stream is the severing, the symbolic and in some ways real severing of Europe, and then sucking Europe to commit political and economic suicide by supporting these wars, the war over Ukraine. The idea with Ukraine was to use Ukraine as a platform to destabilize Russia, break the Russian economy, have an overthrow of Putin by either elites that were pro-Western, fifth column, if you will, or by the masses. That has failed. That strategy has failed. The Ukraine war has failed. And then the other strategy is use Taiwan, just like it has used Ukraine, as a platform to try to provoke and destabilize China, which is underway, but isn't as far along, obviously, as the Ukraine project has been. And that who knows how that's going to play out. The focus now is still Ukraine and Gaza. As for
George,
yes,
let me jump in. I have many colleagues and friends scattered across the European Union. And what is emerging, and it's very clear, at least from this side of the Atlantic, that the people are not supportive of their government's positions. The people are not Russophobic. The majority of the people are not. And there are so many instances of this from the former Yugoslavia, Serbia, Slovakia, Slovenia. You can jump over to Georgia. You can jump to Armenia. The people there are really rising up against their government's stand. And the reason is because they've been cut off from cheap Russian gas. Their economies are in collapse. Inflation is out of sight. They've been told to use less electricity. They've been told to eat and buy less. And so while their governments they're really insane in following the hegemon, because the hegemons put those people all in place, I agree with what you just outlined. I think if the hegemon collapses, Eurasia, China is already in Europe. President Xi just visited Paris, Hungary, and Slovenia. President Putin has established good relationships with those countries and continues to work on diplomatic relations with many of these other quote unquote unfriendly countries. I have to ask you this, George. In the very beginning of our discussion, you talked about the core and the periphery. By the core, do you mean the globalist? Do you mean those extremely rich handful of financial, whatever you want to call them? Is that what you're talking about? That they today see their power and their grip on control of the planet is fading away?
Well, to answer that or respond to that question in a few minutes, I'm not sure I'm capable of doing that, except that the dominant, each now each hegemon has a dominant capitalist class that basically controls, if you will, the state structure. And the dominant class in the United States currently is Wall Street or finance capital. And a secondary power source would be high tech and military production. Are basically the three major forces. So I would argue that finance capital is the dominant force, and those resources go into various think tanks and policy planning organizations that are the sources of ideas and research and the seedbed for policymakers. And all of that has been oriented for 70, 80 years now for an internationalist perspective. And starting under Clinton, it was basically known as globalization, and globalist were the label. I personally just call them imperialist, okay? But what I can also add is that there is two things. There is a struggle, if you will, of hot war going on within those interests in the United States, with an additional component, and that is capital that tends to be oriented towards national profits, if you will. And in some ways, the 2016 Trump was supported more by national capital, although now it looks like that the dominant interests are willing to accept either a Biden or a Trump candidacy. They really aren't making any significant choices, although I personally believe that Biden has already committed political suicide. And I predict that there's a chance he might not even be nominated to be the Democratic Party candidate in August. Keep in mind that in a similar moment in time, although the scale of the crisis was much less than it is now on a global national level, Lyndon Johnson elected to not run for re-election in 1968 when a similar crisis happened, although, again, the proportions are significantly grave and greater. And then the next point I will make is I believe the intensity of the propaganda out of the West and the intensity of the violence, and Gaza is a classic, and the debate and discussions about the escalation of support to the Zelensky cabal and the use of long-range missiles, the more asymmetric politics or aggression striking inside Russia is all rooted in basically what you said, Regis, a recognition of the decline and the acceleration of the decline and the panic of that position as Russia, China, the global South, the BRICS, the restructured BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, et cetera, accelerates. And if we focus more specifically on Gaza, is that both the United States and Israel are clearly pariah states among the vast majority of not only the people of the world, but also most of the countries in the world. For example, up until Gaza, the United States could parade around and say that it represented democracy, human rights, and a rules-based order. It can't say that anymore. Nobody's going to believe that, okay? So what this all entails related to the near and long-term future, I can't answer, but the trajectory is heightened warfare rather than negotiations and peace. Just related to Ukraine, I just can't see the United States sitting down with any person and accepting defeat in Ukraine on a psychological level. So we'll just have to wait and see. My premise is whatever you like to do every day, just do it as much as you can and enjoy it. Okay.
Yeah, that's been my philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
Almost an octogenarian. Live for today, enjoy it as much as you can, because we are so close to the unthinkable. Now, George, we have about 5 minutes left. Let's see. I'd like you to connect Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, the fault line, I think, as you refer to it. There are people who I am associated with here in Russia who believe that the hegemon is already in World War III.
Yes.
But is trying with all its might to provoke a major war between Russia and NATO.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean,
but now I want you to finish up with your comments on this. To me, that's absolutely suicidal. NATO, Europe will not win a war, conventional war, and my God, if it's strategic nuclear weapons or worse. And people can't forget about China. China is watching exactly what's going on. They can feel the same thing coming to them over Taiwan.
Well, one of the ironies of the Wolfowitz doctrine, if we want to use that as the reference point, the idea was to not allow powers to reemerge in Asia. And U.S. policies have actually, not just Biden, but Biden, Trump, Obama, and Bush and Clinton have pushed China and Russia to where they're really joined at the hip. And they've actually the U.S.'s policies have actually created the monster, quote unquote, that they didn't want to exist. And so, I mean, it's almost a black satire of some sort. It's very serious. I guess to finish up any comments, as I said in a recent public talk that I gave, the movie Dr. Strangelove was made in 1963 by Stanley Kubrick. And when I first saw it back in 63, I thought it was a great black and white political satire about the Cold War. And I watch it about every 5, 6, 7 years. And over the years, as I watch it, it becomes less and less a movie and more the daily news. And I guarantee you, if you watch Dr. Strangelove today, it is the evening news. And basically the lunatics in the West have taken over the asylum. And it's scary stuff. It's scary stuff.
George, I have watched Dr. Strangelove many times myself over the years, and I have been saying of late, I hope there isn't some crazed Dr. Strangelove over there that's ready to push the button. Go ahead.
The irony of it is that the people who are managing this now, the Sullivans and the Blinkens, I mean, they're incompetent. I mean, they're horrible imperialists, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the sad thing, that the incompetents are driving us. Even Kissinger, I mean, he's a war criminal, you know. I hope he's not comfortable right now, but Kissinger was a man, you know, he wouldn't be as incompetent as these jokers, you know.
No, you're right.
Yeah. So, yeah.
George, I can't thank you enough. It's been fascinating. And I completely agree with how you've described this historical context, how it's evolved right up to the present day. I'm going to look forward to having you back because we have to have more discussions as these events continue to unfold at warp speed.
At warp speed,
And,
yes.
and
Yes.
you know, I think what our goal is, yours and mine, is try to reach more people. We won't be reaching the millions and the tens of thousands, but if we can reach one or two people who will do something with the information, will become convinced that something has to be done, I think we're doing good work.
Yeah, I'm going to finish up by saying what's important is understanding the big picture, understanding the context. This is not just random events happening. There are trajectories and patterns. And the more you understand that, the more you know how to act related to agency and to understand who's the good guy and the bad guy. Real quick about about Putin. In the United States, you can't talk to anybody, whether they're on the left or liberal, Democrats or conservatives. They all hate Putin here, okay? And I've lost a lot of decent friends because of my political views on this issue. Thank you very much, Regis.
Now, welcome to the club. I mean, I'm living here in the Russian Federation. I have become anathema. I'm a Putinista. I'm a Kremlin asset. Now you are going to be too because you're on this show.
Well, as my mom once said, just tell them the truth, George. Just tell them the truth.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Regis.